సార్
అమ్మ చెప్పురా. చెప్పమ్మా ఎవరమ్మా?
జరాయువు నోట్స్ చెప్పరా సార్?
జరాయువమ్మ క్లాస్
జరాయువుది
ఏంటా?
నోట్స్ చెప్పరా సార్?
ఓకేనమ్మా, ఓకే చెప్పేస్తాను, ఈరోజు చెప్పేద్దామండి. ఓకేనా? నెక్స్ట్ నేను ఏం టాపిక్ చెప్పుకున్నామమ్మా? నేను ఏం చెప్పుకున్నాను టాపిక్ చెప్పండి.
జీవన భౌతిక మండలాల గురించి చెప్పారు సార్.
ఎస్ ఎస్ జీవ భూమండలాలు లేదా జీవ భౌగోళిక మండలాల గురించి చెప్పుకున్నాం. అంటే జియోగ్రఫికల్ రియమ్స్ అంటారు. వాటి గురించి మనం మాట్లాడుకున్నాం. జస్ట్ కొద్దిగా టాపిక్ చెప్పుకున్నాం. నేను ఏం చెప్పుకున్నాం? మెయిన్ భూమి అనేది ఏర్పడిన తర్వాత దాని మీద ఉన్నటువంటి మొత్తం అంతా అంటే అన్ని ఖండాలు కలిపి ఒకే ఒక భూఖండ కింద ఉండేది. ఆ ఖండం పేరు ఏమని చెప్పారమ్మా? ఏం ఖండం అని చెప్పానది? దాని పేరు వెరీ గుడ్, పాంజియో అనే ఖండం కింద ఉండేది. ఆ పాంజియో అనేది 2 ముక్కల కింద విడిపోయింది. ఆ 2 ముక్కలు మళ్ళీ వేరు వేరు భాగాల కింద విడిపోయి ప్రస్తుతం 7 ఖండాల కింద ఏర్పడ్డాయి. అంటే భూమి మీద ప్రస్తుతం 7 ఖండాలు ఉన్నాయి, కాంటినెంట్స్ ఉన్నాయి. ఈ 7 ఖండాల్లో మనది ఏ ఖండం? ఆసియా ఖండం, అంతే కదా. ఇలాగే ఆసియా, ఆఫ్రికా, ఐరోపా, దక్షిణ అమెరికా, ఉత్తర అమెరికా, ఆస్ట్రేలియా, ఇలా మొత్తం 7 ఖండాలుగా ప్రస్తుతం ప్రపంచం అంతా విస్తరించి ఉందన్నమాట. అయితే మొట్టమొదట ఈ ప్రపంచం మీద జీవులు అంటే జంతువులు కానీ మొక్కలు కానీ ఏర్పడుతున్నప్పుడు మొత్తం అంతా ఒకటే ల్యాండ్ మీద ఉండేది కదా, అంటే పాంజియో అనే ల్యాండ్ మీద ఉండేది. ఈ పాంజియో అనే ల్యాండ్ మీద ఉన్నటువంటి ఆ జీవులే విడిపోయిన తర్వాత వేరు వేరు రూపాల్లోకి మార్పులు చెందాయి. కానీ మొత్తం మీద ఏర్పడినటువంటి ఆవిర్భావం మాత్రం ఒకటే. కానీ విడిపోయిన తర్వాత వేరు వేరు వాతావరణ పరిస్థితులకు వచ్చాయి. ఫర్ ఎగ్జాంపుల్ కొంత భాగం ఏం చేసింది? ముందుకు ప్రయాణం చేసి భూమధ్య రేఖకి దగ్గరలో వచ్చింది. భూమధ్య రేఖకి దగ్గరలో ఎలా ఉంటుంది? ఉష్ణోగ్రత చాలా ఎక్కువగా ఉంటుంది, అంటే అత్యధిక ఉష్ణోగ్రత ఉంటుంది అనమాట. ఈ అత్యధిక ఉష్ణోగ్రత ఉన్న ప్రదేశంలో మన ఆ భూమి మీద ఉన్నటువంటి జంతువులు వేరు వేరు ఆకారాలు రూపొందిస్తూ ఉంటాయి. మరికొంత భూమి ఏమైంది? ధ్రువ ప్రాంతాల దగ్గరలోకి వెళ్ళిపోయింది. ధ్రువ ప్రాంతాల దగ్గరలో ఆ చల్లదనం ఎక్కువ ఉంటుంది కాబట్టి అక్కడున్న వాతావరణ పరిస్థితులకు అనుగుణంగా ఆ జీవుల్లో మార్పు వచ్చింది. ఈ విధంగా జీవుల్లో ధ్రువ ప్రాంతాల దగ్గర ఉన్నటువంటి జీవులు ఒక రకంగాను, భూమధ్య రేఖ ప్రాంతంలో ఉన్నటువంటి జీవులు మరో రకంగాను మార్పులు జరగడం జరిగింది. ఈ విధంగా వేరు ప్రాంతాల్లో ఉన్నటువంటి వాతావరణ పరిస్థితులకు అనుగుణంగా జీవులు అనేవి మార్పులు చెందుతూ వచ్చాయి. ఆ జీవులు ఏ విధంగా ఉన్నాయి అనే దాని గురించి ఒక టాపిక్ ఈరోజు మాట్లాడుకుందాం. దాని చెప్పే ముందుగా ఒక చిన్న వీడియో చూపిస్తాను మీకు. ఆ వీడియో చూసిన తర్వాత దాన్ని ఎక్స్ప్లెయిన్ చేసుకుంటూ వెళ్దాం. ఓకేనమ్మా? ఒకసారి చూడండి. వాట్ ఆర్ ది 7 realms ఆఫ్ ది బయోజియోగ్రఫీ అని ఒక వీడియో చూపిస్తాను. ఆ వీడియో ఒకసారి చూడండి. అంటే 7 జీవ భౌగోళిక మండలాలు 7 ఉన్నాయని చెప్పాను కదా, ఆ 7 కూడా ఎలా ఉంటాయి అనే దాని గురించి మీకు వీడియో చూపిస్తాను. చూడమ్మా, భూ మొత్తం ఇదంతా కూడా ఓల్డ్ మ్యాప్, అంతే కదా. ప్రస్తుతం ప్రపంచం ఏ విధంగా ఉందో అదే అనమాట.
It seemed to agree on how many of these the Earth actually has. In school, I was taught that there were.
మీకు అందరికీ తెలుసు కదమ్మా, ఈ భూ ప్రపంచంలో అంటే ప్రపంచ పటం గురించి మీకు ఐడియా ఉంది కదా. మన ఇందులో భారతదేశం ఎక్కడుంది? ఇగో ఇక్కడ ఉంది భారతదేశం. చూడండి, నేను పాయింటర్ చూపిస్తున్నాను. ఇక ఇక్కడ భారతదేశం అనేది ఉంది. ఆ పైన ఉన్నటువంటి ప్రాంతం అంతా కలిపి ఆసియా అని పిలుస్తారు. ఆసియా అంటే ఆసియా ఖండము అని పిలుస్తారు. ఈ ఆసియా ఖండం తర్వాత భాగంలో ఆ ముందు భాగం చూడండి, ఆ ముందు భాగాన్ని ఇక్కడ ఇలా పాయింట్ చూపిస్తున్నాను నేను. ఆ ప్రాంతాన్ని అందరినీ కలిపి యూరప్ అని పిలుస్తారు. ఐరోపా అంటారు తెలుగులో, ఇంగ్లీష్ లో యూరప్ ఖండము అంటారు. దాని కింద చూడండి పెద్ద మండలం ఉంది, ఇదందరినీ కలిపి ఆఫ్రికా ఖండము అంటారు. ఆఫ్రికా ఖండం. దానికి కింద భాగంలో ఉన్నటువంటిది ఇక్కడ ఆస్ట్రేలియా ఖండం. ఇది ఆస్ట్రేలియా ఖండం. దీని ముందు చూడండి, ముందు భాగంలో ఇటు ఒక భాగం ఉంది. ఈ భాగాన్ని ఉత్తర అమెరికా అంటారు, ఈ కింది భాగాన్ని దక్షిణ అమెరికా అంటారు. ఈ విధంగా మొత్తం అంతా కూడా భూ ప్రపంచం ప్రస్తుతం ఉంది.
1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. Though some of you might have been taught that there's a 6 or 6. And some people on YouTube sure seem to like talking about an 8th. But I think the big takeaway from all of this is that the term continent is rather vague, and any way we decide to divvy up land will always be a little
ఒకటే ఒక
arbitrary.
కాంటినెంట్.
But if that leaves you a little unsatisfied, don't worry, you're in good company, which is why, in search for a more definitive answer to what's ultimately an unanswerable question, some people have turned to plate tectonics, which is just kind of a mess. What with all these little weird plates in between the big ones and so on. Others have done even worse and tried to use cultures, in doing so giving themselves the impossible task of drawing straight lines through the murky divisions between groups of people. And then there are some absolute fools who will say, screw it, let's just start from scratch and see where we get. And yet, here we are, no closer to any sort of definitive answer, and honestly, maybe even a little bit more confused. But okay, what if we did something really crazy and say looked at the distribution of plants and animals across the world to see if there's any way to define continents through their native biology? Well, it just so happens that, my friends, that is the beginning of biogeography. Now, lucky for us, someone has already gone through the trouble of dividing the world into 7 biogeographic realms, many of which line up nicely to our preconceived notions of continents. Unlucky for us, in order to actually understand why these are the way that they are, we can't just look at how things are today, but rather we need to look much further back in time to see how past biology and past geography shaped our present biogeography. Or, in other words, we first need a lesson in paleobiogeography. So, buckle up. While life has been found on this planet for over 3 billion years, we only need to look back 200 million years to a time when all the continents of the world had come together into a single supercontinent, Pangaea. This is an ideal time and place for us to start because having all major landmasses physically connected allowed both plant and animal species to freely and completely disperse across any lands they found suitable, briefly creating an original, all-encompassing realm, the Pangaic, under which all terrestrial life was included. While the biology of the Pangaic realm may have looked vastly different from what we're used to today, it would be from this initial melting pot of a gene pool that all subsequent terrestrial life would delineate from. The most recent common ancestor, so to speak. This era of interconnectedness came to an end as the Tethys Seaway began widening, splitting the supercontinent into 2 roughly equal landmasses, Laurasia and Gondwana, sending the biota of each new continent off on their own unique evolutionary trajectory. Contained within Laurasia was North America, Europe, and, well, most Asia, while Gondwana was a conglomerate of South America, Africa, India, Australia, Oceania, and Antarctica. From this point on, the populations between the 2 continents effectively couldn't mix, allowing for 2 distinct biogeographic realms to emerge, the Arctic and the Tropic. Being centered at a much higher latitude, Laurasia was periodically exposed to much lower average temperatures, placing an evolutionary pressure on the plants and animals here to develop cold, hardy bodies, or else offered extinction to any species that couldn't keep itself warm. A good example of how this pressure manifested itself would be in the pine genus, or as the fancy scientists would call the penis genus. Having evolved on Laurasia some 130 million years ago, pine trees quickly distributed themselves across the continent, which is why, even if we look at a modern distribution map for pine trees, we'll see they still exhibit a Laurasian distribution, only growing in lands that once belonged to the Arctic realm. This environmental stress also affected animals, making cold-blooded species less capable of surviving here, while consequently giving warm-blooded animals like mammals the advantage. This explains why it was here that the planet witnessed a huge diversification of mammals into the Laurasiatheria, a whole branch of mammals specific to Laurasia, which consists of many of the animals we're most familiar with today. Included in this development was Perissodactyla, or odd-toed ungulates like horses, donkeys, tapirs, and rhinoceros, Artiodactyla, or the even-toed ungulate, which, holy crap, includes even more popular animals like all camelids, pigs, ruminants like giraffes, deers, antelopes, cat-shaped goats, etc., all the way to hippopotamus and even cetaceans, Rodentia, which are all rodents, and carnivorans, which can be further divided into feline and canine. Try to figure out what kinds of animals fit into those categories. However, just like its its predecessor, as Laurasia aged, it too began to break apart, with the Central Atlantic Rift cutting a line between Europe and Greenland, effectively splitting the Arctic realm in two. On one side, the Palearctic, the Paleo in reference to this being considered by many to be part of the Old World. On the other side, the Nearctic, or the New World Arctic. Altogether, the shared natural history of these two realms explains why basically all flora and fauna across North America has a direct analog to be found across Eurasia, and vice versa. This similarity in biology was only reinforced with the periodic reconnection of Asia to North America across the Bering Strait, allowing further exchange between these seemingly distant lands. Okay, so that's 2 out of the 7 biogeographic realms, meaning that the remaining 5 all came from the breakup of Gondwana. Having stayed as a whole much closer to the warmth of the equator, evolution on Gondwana took its own path, one that was less influenced by temperature, resulting in a flora and fauna better adapted to tropical climates, hence the title tropic for this realm. And so, just like how the Laurasiatheria developed on Laurasia, here the Gondwanatheria began to emerge as well. Notably, it was around 70 million years ago that the first true primates evolved somewhere in the center of Africa. By this time, Gondwana had already begun splitting apart, meaning primates weren't able to fully distribute themselves and instead were only able to reach South America and India. This explains why the modern distribution of primates, minus humans of course, looks like this, reflecting a late Gondwanan dispersal. As Gondwana broke up even further, so too did the tropical realm. South America and Africa became the largest fragments, causing the Gondwanatheria to diverge into the Xenarthra and the Afrotheria, signifying the two continents becoming their own distinct biogeographical realms in the process, the Neotropic and the Afrotropic. From an assortment of common ancestors, South America
ఇక్కడ చూడమ్మా, ఇప్పుడు దక్షిణ అమెరికా అనేది ఆఫ్రికా, ఈ రెండు భాగాలు కూడా ఒకే పార్ట్ నుంచి ఏర్పడాయి అనమాట. దక్షిణ అమెరికాలో ఉండే ప్రాంతాన్ని ఏమంటున్నామంటే నియోఆర్కిటిక్ అంటారు అనమాట. అలాగే ఇక్కడ ఆఫ్రోట్రాపిక్ అంటున్నారు. ఇక్కడ పదాలు జాగ్రత్తగా
ended up with animals like the sloth, Arthra, and the Afrotheria, signifying the two continents becoming their own distinct biogeographical realms in the process, the Neotropic and the Afrotropic. From an assortment of common ancestors, South America ended up with animals like the sloth, anteaters, and the armadillo, while the Afrotheria became things like aardvarks, hyraxes, and tenrecs. Without any of the Arctic megafauna, this left room for larger herbivores to emerge from these groups. So in South America, common sloths were free to speciate into the enormous ground and aquatic sloths. Anteaters became, well, giant anteaters, and the armadillo family diversified into glyptodonts. In Africa, the same thing happened, where a relative of the hyrax started growing bigger and bigger, losing most of its hair while its nose got much longer, giving birth to the order Proboscidea, the only surviving member of which being the elephant. At one point, a relative of the elephant even began living aquatically, first staying within the shallows, presumably using its trunk as a sort of snorkel, but eventually fully adapted to the water and speciated into Sirenia, becoming dugongs and manatees. Africa, however, never fully escaped the reach of Laurasia, having reconnected with Asia approximately 30 million years ago. This opened up the two lands for exchange, with many of the Laurasian mammals coming down into Africa, filling the continent with even and odd-toed ungulates, felines, and canines, and so on. Relatives of the elephants also managed to make their way into the Palearctic, adapting to the cold conditions by growing bigger and regrowing thick fur, resulting in mammoths, mastodons, Stegodontidae, and Moatherium. By using the Bering land bridge, these species were even able to enter the Nearctic realm, explaining how a genus originating in Africa made it all the way to North America. Overall, due to its more recent connection to Eurasia, the north of Africa has largely been colonized by species of the Palearctic. So much so, in fact, that it is now included as part of that realm. As many of the species we associate most with Africa, lions, rhinos, zebras, giraffes, hyenas, all got their evolutionary start in the Arctic realm. The Afrotropic was still partially preserved, however, thanks to the Sahara Desert, retaining its primates and most of its plant species, and even produced us humans, which, as we all know, went out from the Afrotropic to extensively colonize every other realm on Earth. South America, on the other hand, remained isolated from about 80 million years ago until about 20 million years ago, when the Panamanian land bridge began to reach out from North America to join the two continents together. This kickstarted what's known as the Great American Interchange, a mixing of endemic species that continues to this day. This wasn't a fair and equal fusion, however. As I already mentioned, prior to this recombination, North America has been sporadically reconnected to Asia through the Bering Land Bridge. This not only brought the Nearctic and the Palearctic realms temporarily back together, but later this also meant African and Indian influences reached all the way to North America. The effect of this was that only the most competitive animals prevailed across these related realms, stacking the Nearctic with far more robust species when compared to those
ఇక్కడ
hosted.
చూడమ్మా ఇప్పుడు ఇక్కడ చూడమ్మా ఇక్కడ యానిమల్స్ ఉన్నాయి కదా, ఈ యానిమల్స్ లో ఏనుగులు కానీ లేకపోతే ఈ కెనైన్స్ అంటే ఏవైతే మాంసాహారులుగా ఉంటాయో అవి కానీ అవన్నీ కూడా మొట్టమొదట ఆఫ్రికా కంట్రీలో ఏర్పడ్డాయి. ఆఫ్రికా కంట్రీలో ఏర్పడిన తర్వాత అక్కడి నుంచి నెక్స్ట్ దక్షిణ అమెరికాకు కానీ, దక్షిణ అమెరికా నుంచి ఉత్తర అమెరికాకు కానీ అటువైపు ప్రయాణం చేయడం. అలాగే ముందు వైపుకి అంటే తూర్పు వైపుకి ఎలా ప్రయాణం చేసాయి, ఆఫ్రికా ఖండం నుంచి భారతదేశానికి వచ్చాయి, భారతదేశం నుంచి ఆసియా ప్రాంతానికి, ఆసియా ప్రాంతం నుంచి మిగిలిన ప్రాంతాలకి వ్యాపించాయి అని ప్రస్తుతం సైంటిస్టులు కనుక్కోవడం జరిగింది. దీనిలో చూడండి ఒకే రకమైనటువంటి ఏనుగులు వేరు వేరు రకాలు ఉంటాయి. ఫర్ ఎగ్జాంపుల్ యూరప్ దేశంలో మ్యామత్ అని ఉండేవి. మ్యామత్ అంటే ఏనుగు లాంటివే కానీ డిఫరెంట్ టైప్స్ అనమాట. ఫర్ ఎగ్జాంపుల్ ఆఫ్రికన్ ఎలిఫెంట్, ప్రపంచంలో అతిపెద్ద జంతువు ఏది అంటే ఆఫ్రికన్ ఎలిఫెంట్ కదా. ఆ ఆఫ్రికన్ ఎలిఫెంట్ అనేవి అభివృద్ధి చెందిన తర్వాత అక్కడి నుంచి యూరప్ కాంటినెంట్కి వెళ్ళాయి. యూరప్ కాంటినెంట్లో ఏమైంది, అక్కడ ఉన్నటువంటి శీతల వాతావరణ పరిస్థితుల్లో వాటి పరిమాణం చాలా పెద్ద పరిమాణంలో మారిపోయింది. అంత పెద్ద పరిమాణంలో ఉన్నటువంటి వాటిని మ్యామత్ అని పిలుస్తారు అనమాట. అంటే ఇక్కడ ఉన్నటువంటి ఈ ఎలిఫెంట్స్ లోనే ఒక రకం అనమాట. ఆ మ్యామతులు ఏర్పడ్డాయి. మ్యామతుల తర్వాత మన భారతదేశంలోకి వచ్చి భారతదేశంలో ఇండియన్ ఎలిఫెంట్ అనే ప్రత్యేక జాతి కింద ఏర్పడింది. ఈ విధంగా ఆవిర్భావం, ప్రతి జాతి యొక్క ఆవిర్భావం కూడా ఒకే ప్రాంతం నుంచి ఉంటుంది. అక్కడి నుంచి వేరు వేరు ప్రాంతాలకు ప్రయాణం చేసి అక్కడ కొత్త స్పీసీస్ కింద ఏర్పడడం జరిగిందనమాట. అదే ఆయన ఎక్స్ప్లెయిన్ చేస్తారు.
In neotropical isolation. And so, when these two realms collided, many of the unique and specially adapted species of South America were replaced by the more generalist species of the north. Incoming ungulates like camelids entered and evolved into llamas and alpacas. Felines came here to diversify into jaguars and cougars, and even rodentia spread from north to south, growing to sizes never before attained by rodents like capybaras and maras, all the while helping to push native animals like ground sloths and glyptodonts into extinction. But this is also where the lines really start to blur, as plants don't exactly follow the same rules as animals. So while Nearctic animals were more successful overall at invading the Neotropic, the tropical climate of Central America gave a localized edge to advancing Neotropical plants. The result of which being plant communities of South American origin coming to dominate all the way up to Mexico, where both the climate and therefore the flora begins transitioning to Nearctic. An interesting effect of this is that even though Nearctic animals may be more widely adaptable, in terms of animals especially adapted for tropical rainforests, those of the Neotropic still reign supreme, allowing other neotropical animals to infiltrate deeper into North America and pushing the line of the Neotropic as far north as the Central American rainforests would reach. Overall, this makes the whole of Mesoamerica a tremendous transitional zone, filling countries like Mexico with some of the most diverse collections of flora and fauna to be found anywhere in the world. A similar process of recombining realms can be found when looking at India. You see, India broke from Gondwana approximately 130 million years ago and spent 80 million years adrift in the middle of what would become the Indian Ocean. Similar to South America, this isolation bred a very unique biota, and soon enough a distinct Indian realm came about, one derived from the greater tropical realm. Primates especially had a field day. Having come about only 70 million years ago, their only route to colonizing India would have been a random rafting event, meaning it was likely only a single primate species that found its way aboard this leaving ship. But over the next 50 million years, this common ancestor would come to diversify into a number of species, what would become gibbons, macaques, and langurs. This isolation didn't last, however, and around 50 million years ago, India came into contact with southern Asia, opening up a new arena for Palearctic and Indic species to interchange. The only difference here is that while yes, mixing did occur, the arrival of India also led to the building of the Himalayas, which served as the world's biggest barrier for traversing plants and animals. While these mountains shielded most of India, preserving much of the Indian realm, an opening was left going through southeastern Asia, leading to a fusion of Indian and Malayan species, the result being the modern-day realm of Indo-Malaya. This is all made slightly more complicated by the fact that only a few thousand years ago, lower sea levels brought much more of the Malay archipelago above the ocean, forming the Sundaland. This opened an avenue for Indo-Malayan flora and fauna to expand as far as this shelf reached, and remain here even after rising sea levels turned much of the region back into scattered islands. Why the Indo-Malayan realm doesn't include all of these islands, however, has to do with Australia. Also once belonging to Gondwana, a joined Australia and Antarctica broke apart from the supercontinent at roughly the same time that India did. The two southern continents remained attached in isolation for another 40 million years, together forging a new Australic realm. Rewind a bit, and it was approximately 100 million years ago that the first marsupials evolved in modern-day North America. From here they migrated south, possibly using the Caribbean islands to colonize South America, while subsequently going extinct further north. South America remained attached to Antarctica by its southern tip until around 30 million years ago, giving marsupials a pathway to expand further. But it was also around this time that the Southeast Indian Ridge started breaking the continents apart, literally sending Antarctica to the shadow realm while Australia got lucky and pushed further northward. Right in the middle of this, about 50 million years ago, when the two landmasses weren't too far removed yet, a single marsupial managed to raft over to Australia, where it found a land devoid of most other mammals on account of the continent's isolation. Without any mammalian competition, marsupials had finally found the one place where they could become the dominant animals of the realm. This dominance allowed the single ancestral species to diversify into a variety of forms and functions, with herbivores like kangaroos, koalas, and wombats, and carnivores like quolls, Tasmanian devils, and thylacines. The Australic realm, of course, included a lot more different animals, but hey, it's easier to talk about specific examples than to mention every single living thing that found its way here. But as time went on, the Australian landmass went through some changes, losing Zealandia while building up mass towards its front that would become New Guinea as well as surrounding islands. These islands would come to share in the biology of Australia, in the process forming the Australasian realm. But as these land masses pushed further and further north, they eventually came into close proximity with the Indonesian islands, and by extension the Indo-Malayan realm. So, despite on a surface level appearing to be part of the same archipelago, there are in fact two distinct groups of islands here, separated by every biogeographer's favorite line, the Wallace Line, defining the border between Indo-Malaya and Australasia. Of course, as we should all know by now, there are no straight or clear lines in nature, and as a result of their proximity, a new interchange has kickstarted between the two realms as plants and animals cross the narrow waterways between islands, blending species from both realms together. Okay, that's it, right? We're done? Oh yeah, and then there was Antarctica. I'm pretty sure we all know how this one ends, so I'll try to make this fast. Despite starting as the southernmost component of Gondwana, for the longest time Antarctica was a highly habitable land, and enjoyed a golden age brought about by the global greenhouse climate of the Earth at the time. During this period, it would have closely resembled neighboring Australia, which stayed connected until about 100 million years ago, finding its spot at the South Pole by around 80 million years ago. Even at the bottom of the planet, Antarctica remained warm enough for life to thrive for another 30 million years or so. In this time, Antarctica's biology likely diverged substantially from Gondwanan and even Australian biology, to the point where a new biogeographic realm was realized, the Antarctic realm. But as we all know, the planet began to cool as it entered a new ice age just 3 million years ago, and nowhere on Earth was affected more by this change than Antarctica. Year after year, temperatures steadily dropped. Soon enough, ice began to build up, and didn't stop building until the whole continent was under literal miles of ice, extinguishing virtually all native Antarctic life in the process. Putting the wide-scale extinction aside, though, the true shame of this is that all the fossils left behind now lay buried under miles of ice, meaning whatever unique biology that could have developed here before the freeze remains utterly hidden and unknowable to us now, leaving Antarctica's paleobiology as a huge blind spot within the field. Altogether, this leaves the Earth with 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 distinct terrestrial realms. Well, actually, I didn't want to bring this up in the beginning, but there's actually a little bit of an 8th realm. And no, it's not Zealandia, but it's actually not that far off either. You see, if you watched my Earth's Lost Landmasses video, you'll know that the Pacific Ocean is the site of a lot of new land-building processes, both as a result of tectonic uplifts and continuous volcanism, constructing islands entirely independent of all other lands on Earth. With no natural history to draw from, each newly created island must build their own distinct flora and faunas from whatever seeds, birds, or the tides may bring over. Being situated within the Pacific Ocean, which covers a third of the planet's surface, means the islands of the Pacific are perfectly situated to receive inputs from nearly all of the biogeographic realms, save for the Afrotropic. What's been created is a fascinating laboratory where all sorts of different combinations between realms can take place, producing a unique array of biology on every single island. If this wide range of potential inputs wasn't enough, once these castaway species reach their final island destinations, from here they set off on their very own journey of evolutionary exploration, one that's defined by whatever peculiar environmental conditions are harbored therein. In turn, it is these island dwellers that are most active in seeding whatever new islands might arise within the Pacific volcanic arena. What this all means is that while this prismatic gene pool makes it impossible to generalize the oceanic realm, it nonetheless constitutes in and of itself a distinct biota, connected through a disconnection to any others, universal in its uncategorizability. Hawaii is a fascinating case study of all of these principles at work. Not only does the Hawaiian island chain represent the largest islands within the realm, but also some of the most isolated, being 3,700 kilometers from the nearest continental lands of California, part of the Nearctic, 5,300 kilometers from Palearctic lands, 8,500 kilometers from the Indo-Malayan realm, 6,400 kilometers from Australasia, and 8,400 kilometers from the Neotropic. Despite being located closest to North America, prevailing ocean currents lead the waters of the northern Pacific to circulate counterclockwise, acting as a conveyor belt delivering material from all over the ocean to these islands. This explains why, when analyzing the plant species present and deciphering their realm of origin, it was found that Indo-Malaya was the greatest source of native Hawaiian plant species, having supplied 21% of Hawaiian flora, despite being the furthest away. The Nearctic was the second most influential, that's unsurprising, supplying 19%. What's really interesting, however, is just how much was contributed by other areas. East Asia was next, contributing 17% of native Hawaiian species. The Neotropic supplied 12%, and even 9% originated from far away Australasia. If you're following along and doing the math in your head, you'll find that there's still about 22% of the Hawaiian gene pool that's unaccounted for.
ఇక్కడ ఈ పాయింట్ చూడమ్మా, అంటే జీవులన్నీ కూడా ఒక ప్రాంతం నుంచే మైగ్రేట్ అయ్యాయి వేరే ప్రాంతానికి. ఇక్కడ ఒక పాయింట్ చూడమ్మా, జీవులన్నీ కూడా ఒక ప్రాంతం నుంచే మరో ప్రాంతానికి మైగ్రేట్ అయ్యాయి. ఒకే ఖండంలో ఏర్పడినటువంటి ఈ జీవులు అనేవి వేరు వేరు ప్రాంతాలకు అభివృద్ధి పరిచయబడ్డాయి, వేరు వేరు ప్రాంతాలకు డిస్ట్రిబ్యూట్ అయ్యాయి అని చెప్పడానికి ఒక బెస్ట్ ఎగ్జాంపుల్ ఏంటంటే హవాయ్ ఐలాండ్స్ అనమాట. ఈ హవాయ్ ఐలాండ్స్ అనేవి అమెరికా ఉంది కదా, ఉత్తర అమెరికాకి దూరంగా ఉంటాయి అన్నమాట. అంటే టోటల్గా వేరే దేశాలతో దేనితోని సంబంధం కలిగి ఉండవు, చాలా దూరం. ఇందాక చెప్పాడు కదా, ప్రతి ప్రాంతం నుంచి కూడా 5,600 కిలోమీటర్లు